Your Excellency Minister, heads of state delegations, ambassadors, special envoys, ladies and gentlemen. Please allow me to welcome you to the Prague Ministerial of the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, the Article 18 Alliance. Our world is like a colorful mosaic made up of people of various faiths and beliefs. Unfortunately, many authoritarian regimes, dictators and terrorists are trying to either break this mosaic or paint it with one single color, mostly with bloody red. We are gathered here today in an effort to preserve this unique mosaic, put the scattered pieces together, build trust, and open new channels of communication and cooperation in helping specific people all over the globe who are suffering for their faith or belief. Czechs are known for not losing their sense of humor in any situation. This is one of their secret keys for survival. So I have to start with a joke too. There was once in Russia a chief of police who lost his favorite luxury watch while out for a walk. He was so sad that he had it announced that whoever found it could wish for whatever he wanted. It just happened that an old Jew, Horowitz, found the watch. Horowitz came to the chief of police and returned the watch he found. The police chief asked him, "What would you like as a reward? Do you want money?" Horowitz replies, "No, thank you." "So, what do you want?" "I would only wish, sir, that you would forget that I exist." We must never forget those who suffer for their belief, sitting somewhere in prison or in captivity, facing charges or even death. Even if we only help one such a person, it makes sense. This can be proven by the example of Buddhist lawyer Nguyen Bac Truyen, who was sentenced first to 3 and then to 11 years in prison for his peaceful advocacy of religious freedom, democratic reforms, and human rights. After 6 years in prison, thanks to the global efforts of many good people, he was released, and he will be here with us later today. And now allow me please to give the floor to His Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, Jan Lipavský. Your Excellency Minister, please allow me to thank you for finding time to honor us with your presence, even before your departure to the NATO security meeting in Brussels.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Černý Palace, the seat of the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's such an honor to host this event in Prague. First, let me express my profound thanks to all the co-organizers for making this year's Ministerial Conference on Freedom of Religion or Belief possible. Since 2018, the Alliance has been doing an important work on those issues, and we are proud to be part of this endeavor. We are living in difficult times. Democracy, the rule of law, and human rights are under attack. We need to find ways how to protect these vital values. We need to further promote them. Forums like this are important platforms to discuss new approaches. For over a year and a half, Ukraine has been facing brutal Russian aggression. The whole of Europe and ultimately the entire international community is feeling its effects. It's not a territorial conflict. The aims of the Putin's regimes go far beyond the control of Ukraine. In fact, the brutal attack on Ukraine is a part of Russia's much larger fight against liberal democracy, freedom, and human rights. The aggression against Ukraine has also had a devastating effect on the right to free exercise of religion for many people. A few weeks ago, we were all horrified by the images of Hamas terrorists killing more than 1,000 of civilians, including women and children, in communities around Gaza and kidnapping others. In the aftermath, the number of anti-Semitism incidents worldwide have increased by 500%. We also see rapid growth of Islamophobia and religious hatred in general. Our friendship and cooperation need to be an essential part of our answer to the challenges we face. Activities of the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance are important elements in our common struggle to uphold human rights worldwide. The right to freedom or religion or belief is an essential component of human rights, of promotion of tolerance, peace, and diversity. It is both an individual right and an obligation of the state to protect, pursue, and nurture. Religious leaders can play a crucial role in facilitating dialogue, preventing further divisions. 2 weeks ago, we commemorated the 34th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, and that brought down the communist regime in former Czechoslovakia and ushered a new era. Ever since, support for democracy, human rights, and civil society has been one of the main features of Czech foreign policy. It draws on the tradition of active, responsible, and humanistic politics. It is based on historical experience and value principles such as the conviction that we all share the same set of fundamental rights. These principles must be upheld even in the face of evil. We know from our own bitter experience where appeasement leads. The very first panel of this conference will be devoted to those issues: the systematic suppression of religious freedoms under the communist rule and misuses of religion to achieve political aims that we witness in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Religious freedom in the era of new technologies is an important topic that this conference will discuss. I believe that Czech experience in transitioning from communism to democracy remains an asset to our efforts in upholding democracy and human rights in the world. Our activities in this alliance are a natural part of the commitment to promote human rights. We take our own responsibilities to pursue religious tolerance domestically and internationally. We also fully realize that in order to succeed, it has to be a shared responsibility of the international community. In fact, this must be a joint endeavor of all of us, governments, religious leaders, and civil society. This is why conferences and processes like this one are the essential part of this struggle. They provide a vital platform to think and discuss. Therefore, I wish you productive and enriching discussion in the upcoming days. Thank you very much for your attention.
Your Excellency, thank you for your kind words. And let me now ask the chair of the International Alliance for Religious Freedom or Belief and a member of the British Parliament, the British Prime Minister Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief, Fiona, to make her opening remarks. At the same time, I would like to ask her to introduce the first of our two esteemed keynote speakers, and her compatriot, Lord Alton of Liverpool, independent member of the UK House of Lords.
Good morning, everyone. As chair of the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, the Article 18 Alliance, or IRFBA for short, can I add my warm welcome to you, to the 2023 Freedom of Religion or Belief Ministerial. My thanks to Minister Lipavský for opening this conference. Děkuji. Did I get that right? And to his government for hosting. And to all our exemplary speakers for giving us your valuable time. We look forward to listening to you and learning from you. And on behalf of all of you, I want to pay a particular tribute to the Vice Chair of our Alliance, Ambassador Robert Řehák, for successfully taking up the considerable challenge of planning and delivering this important conference. Ambassador Řehák, we owe you a great debt of gratitude. Thank you. Only those who have organised such a conference know quite what is involved. But fortunately, Ambassador Řehák will have 1 month to recover before he takes over as chair of the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance in January 2024. And I'm very excited to see how our alliance will be taken forward under Robert's chairmanship. I'm just hoping the rest of us can keep up. Colleagues, who I know care so much about the people who suffer so much across the world, the rights of religious minorities are under attack as never before. Freedom of religion or belief has never been a more important cause to champion, whether in government, the courts of law, academia, or the wider public square, for the simple reason that there have never been more people at risk, never more heinously and despicably denied their wish to live out their beliefs freely, never more people experiencing abuse, emotional or material hardship, incarceration or even death, simply on account of what they believe. My work as the UK Prime Minister's Special Envoy has brought me into contact with some of the most heartrending of these cases and the bravest of people, which makes us all the more conscious of the privilege we have to live in countries where it is not too costly to think what we like and to say what we think. And as chair of IRFBA, I have been humbled by the realization that all too often I have seen opposing persecution or discrimination on account of what people believe as a worthy principle, a principle worth fighting for. But for many, it is more than a principle. It is a lived reality. And that includes many of our Central European colleagues, countries which suffered much under authoritarianism and now face Putin crouching at their door. It is this fact that makes our work worth it, namely, that around the world and today in the 21st century, there are countless men, women and children who suffer, whether under the hard arm of authoritarian regimes or at the ruthless whim of militant extremists. They need not just our voices, but our partnership. Not just our words, but our actions. Not just our goodwill, but our good deeds. And the good news is that more action, more practical steps are increasingly being taken by many, including many of you in this room. Grassroots activists, lawyers, academics, civil society experts, NGOs, faith leaders, parliamentarians, and government representatives, all working together to promote, protect, and defend freedom of religion or belief. Working together as never before. And it's been my privilege as chair of IRFBA to work with people like you on a daily basis over the last 2 years. you help ensure that the collective voice of 42 OVFA countries is stronger than our individual country voices alone. Allow me to briefly tell you of some of the work of the OVFA Alliance and our country representatives this past year. Through our working groups on religious and cultural heritage, and thank you Estonia and my UK Deputy David Burrows. On atrocity prevention, thank you Romania. Our working group on gender, thank you Norway and Australia. And can I put an additional thanks on record to Ambassador Chiara Porro from Australia for so faithfully serving on the OVFA Steering Committee this year. And through our education working group, thank you Czech Republic. Indeed, the Education Working Group had the privilege of helping to inspire last month's 24-hour Global Youth Summit, which brought together over 500 young participants from 77 countries across 6 continents to debate freedom of religion or belief and how to rise to the challenges of today. Thank you to everyone who made that happen. And later today, the result of a year-long pilot on education will be launched, a pilot project on teaching freedom of religion or belief to children aged 4 to 11 years old, with lesson plans devised and delivered in schools across the UK. And OVFA country members also undertook 4 international visits this past year. A delegation with representatives ably led by Ambassador Řehák from 15 countries visited Lebanon to learn of and share best practice on promoting freedom of religion or belief. A solidarity visit to Ukraine was made. Thank you to our Ukrainian representative. OVFA delegations travelled to Algeria and Nepal, meeting government representatives there, but also meeting individuals facing court action on account of their religion or belief. Advocacy toolkits were provided to help our OVFA colleagues champion virtually in countries such as Nicaragua and Tibet. Statements were issued in support of religious minority groups and a deep dive held on countering anti-Semitism. And our spring gathering in Geneva this year sparked what needs to be an ongoing piece of work, aiming to ensure that the review of the Sustainable Development Goals in the run-up to 2030 take into account, as they have not done to date, those left behind and often driven into poverty on account of their religion or belief. But for me, the most exciting work of OVFA this year has been our advocacy for individual prisoners of conscience, brave people imprisoned directly as a result of their religion or belief. People like the 2 Iranian grandmothers who served 10 years in prison in Iran simply for being Baha'is. And after they were released, they were rearrested and sentenced to another 10 years, which they are currently bravely serving. Or people like the young 19-year-old Sufi Muslim Yahya Sharif Aminu, sentenced to death by a Nigerian court following allegations of blasphemy, simply because he wrote a song which was put out on social media by a friend. His case is now on appeal, and we are proud and privileged to support him and others. OVFA highlights 1 or 2 such prisoners each month. A chair's statement is published in their support, and as chair, I try to make direct contact with the government involved. We've supported a case of 15 individuals so far, from China to Vietnam, from Iran to Myanmar, and you will see that each of the sessions of this ministerial is dedicated to one of our religious prisoners of conscience. This session is dedicated to Bishop Alvarez of Nicaragua, currently in prison for 26 years for defending from his own pulpit his co-citizens' right to freedom of religion or belief. But I'm delighted to report that two of the individuals we supported in 2022, along with support from others in the international community, were released this year. Young Hannah Abdimalek, a Christian from Somaliland, and Shamil Kamikov, an elderly Jehovah's Witness from Tajikistan. If, as a result of our endeavours, we can help but one more prisoner of conscience know our solidarity and taste the liberty we enjoy, then this work is worth it. So, in closing, thank you. Thank you to every IRFBA country colleague who engages with our work. Thank you to our US Secretariat. Thank you to our amazing Council of Experts. The work I have described would not happen without you. And if you are here today and your country is not in IRFBA, in our alliance, seek to join. Or if you are an IRFBA friend, become a member. If you are a member country, what more can you do to support our work? And if you're from civil society, you're welcome to work with us. And as I said earlier, FORB has never been more at risk. Abuses affect countless millions. This is not a niche topic. FORB concerns should be at the preserve of not just this ministerial conference, but core concerns at every international summit, because they are at the core of so many human rights violations across the world today. But we are on the offensive. There has never before been such a connected coalition determined to collaborate to defeat the enemies of FORB violations. A coalition represented by you here in this room today. Good people, doing good deeds, turning words into action. Thank you. We all have a part to play. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, David Alton, my colleague in the UK Parliament, who sits as Lord Alton of Liverpool as an independent in the House of Lords. For almost 20 years, David sat as a Member of Parliament in the House of Commons, and he was one of the founders of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Freedom of Religion or Belief, a group that now has 170 members from our Parliament, from right across the political spectrum. His most recent book was published last year on genocide. And because I know David has 20 minutes to speak, and I could speak for 20 minutes about all that David has done on freedom of religion or belief, if you want to know more about him, please look on his website, davidalton.net. Please give David a very warm welcome.
We wish the Minister much success in his negotiations in these difficult times. We are very glad that you honoured us with your presence, Your Excellency. Please, once more, thank to Minister of Foreign Affairs.
First of all, thank you very much for the warmth of that welcome and introduction. My first engagement at this ministerial was last night, was meeting some of the young people who are here at the conference. And I sat with a young Israeli woman, with a young Indian woman, and a young man from Indonesia. And they asked me, what difference could you make? And I told them the story of a young man who came into my university office 10 years ago, and he had escaped from North Korea. And I said, what is it you want to do? And he said, I want to make a difference one day in my own country. And Timothy now has a master's degree from the University of Liverpool. He worked in Fiona's office for a year learning about politics. And Timothy is now the clerk to our all-party parliamentary group on North Korea. And last week, on 3 separate occasions, met with the visiting president of the Republic of Korea, who was in the United Kingdom on a state visit. That's the difference that one life can make. And when Robert said earlier on that you have to do something even if it's only for one person, it reminded me of an extension of that thought, which is that just because you can't change the entire world is not a reason for not trying to change any of it. And it brought to mind the story of a boy who was walking along a beach on which starfish had been washed up in their thousands as the tide retreated. And the boy was walking along the beach, throwing them back one by one. And the inevitable adult came along and said to the boy, "You can't throw them all back in. You'll never do it. It won't make any difference." And the boy, with infinite wisdom, like the young people I met last night, turned to the adult and said, "It'll make a difference to that one." And if that's all we can do, and if all we can do here at this conference, at the Ministerial, is to pass on the baton to the next generation, then let's do that. Those 3 young people I met last night, from very different backgrounds, were united in their common belief in the importance of standing up for the right to believe, and in coexistence, what our late Chief Rabbi in the United Kingdom, the wonderful Jonathan Sacks, said is respecting, in the title of one of his books, the dignity of difference, and in the title of another of his books, building our home together. So that, I think, is the example that we must spread. And the baton has been passed to us, and that's where I want to start my own remarks, because next week, on December the 9th, will mark the 75th anniversary of the proclamation of the Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide, the Genocide Convention. It was the very first human rights treaty adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it signified the international community's commitment to never again, after the Holocaust and the associated atrocities committed during the Second World War. It was, of course, the work of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer, 49 of whose relatives were murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust. It was his response to a lifetime of studying atrocities like mass murder of the Syrian and Armenian Christians. It was in response to Winston Churchill and a radio broadcast he had made in which he said there was no word in the English language adequate to describe the monstrous crimes of the Reich. It was a word whose etymology is drawn from the Latin and the ancient Greek, genos and side, meaning the severing, the cutting, the breaking, the annihilation of part of the human family. This crime, above all crimes, often originating in a visceral hatred of others because of their religion or their ethnicity, finally had a name. And it brought with it duties to states to predict, to prevent, to protect, and to punish. But 75 years later, it is still a crime committed with impunity. 75 years ago, on the following day, on December the 10th, 1948, the United Nations promulgated the 30 articles contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 18, we saw it on our screens at the very outset of today's proceedings. Article 18 of which insists that everyone has the right to believe, the right not to believe, and the right to change their belief. It is the duty, friends, of the United Nations Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, and the Security Council to uphold what for many of us here is a sacred duty, but it too is daily honoured in its breach, notably by the authoritarian regimes that we've been asked to talk about and discuss at this Ministerial. There is then a sort of umbilical link, a direct connection between the UDHR and the Genocide Convention, because when you ignore the human rights of individuals, including religious freedom, and choose silence rather than risk censure, it invariably leads to persecution, to atrocities, and then to genocide. Edith Stein, murdered by the Nazis, was right in stating her words, "Those who remain silent are responsible." Another victim of the Nazis, Poland's Maximilian Kolbe, could have been speaking of our own times when he said, "The deadliest poison of our age is indifference." while the great German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act." So the difference, as Rabbi Rosen said to us earlier on, between a noun and a verb. This fundamental and foundational freedom is routinely ignored by policymakers. As a boy, I was shocked, but also inspired by the stories from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union about the suffering of believers and the nature of totalitarianism. My own father had enlisted as a soldier after the Nazis invaded Poland, and he'd been at the Battle of Monte Cassino, and he told me about the extraordinary bravery of Polish soldiers. I'd read about the 1956 Hungarian uprising, the imprisonment of religious and political dissenters. And in 1968, my journey in a way started in Prague because as a 17-year-old, I organised a town protest and a public petition following the crushing of Alexander Dubček's Prague Spring, when Soviet tanks crushed modest attempts at Czech liberalisation. I was once privileged to meet Václav Havel here in Prague, who described how during the communist era in Czechoslovakia, it felt as if everyone had been compromised by the nature of a regime in which personal survival had become the foremost consideration. He said that the population was often living a lie in which truth had become the first casualty, that, his words, the saving message is that the truth prevails for those who live in truth. And he added that in the formation of the next generation of leaders, the passing on of the baton, he said, these ideals, these values, his words, might be inscribed on the Moses baskets of every nation's babies. Perhaps that should be our objective over these few days, to inscribe the words on the next generation's Moses baskets. I went with him and a small group to Lidice, the Czech village chosen as a target for reprisals in the wake of the assassination of the Gestapo's Heydrich, the principal architect, of course, of the Holocaust. In reprisal, 172 boys and men between the ages of 14 and 84 were shot, and most of the women and children were sent to concentration camps. The village had been destroyed. But in a curious way, the story, of course, didn't end there. And here is where the actions of one person can make a difference. Because a British Member of Parliament in 1947, Sir Barnet Stroth, came and saw Lidice, and he decided to raise the money to rebuild the village at Lidice. Perhaps as I share these stories today, tragic stories, we can keep in mind the possibility and the challenge that even out of such horror, we always have the chance to rebuild and to renew. Last year, as Fiona has reminded us, was a terrible year. I see that Henrietta Blythe is here from Open Doors. In their report, they estimated that some 360 million Christians experienced, their words, high levels of persecution and discrimination worldwide. 13 Christians killed every day because of their faith. But Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, Baha'is, Yazidis, Ahmadis, Hazaras, Shia, humanists and many others suffer in society where no respect is shown for Article 18. Now, as a small way of addressing silence, ignorance and indifference, several years ago I suggested to the Board of Aid to the Church in Need on which I served that we should at least use one day a year, a practical thing to do, during the November month of remembrance to commemorate the victims of religious persecution, and that we should call it Red Wednesday. And just a week ago, with Fiona, we took part in Red Wednesday events in the United Kingdom Parliament. The British Foreign Office, and Sue Breeze from the FCDO is here with us at the conference, they lit up the whole of the Foreign Office in red for that purpose, that day, in order to show solidarity with victims of persecution. But it also reminds us, using an English idiom, to see red, to get indignant about this, to see red and not be indifferent to the suffering caused by religious persecution. It's a major factor in conflict and also in the displacement worldwide. There are 110 million people displaced worldwide. It's at the heart of the refugee crisis. But rather than tackling the causes and the reasons why people are displaced, we tend to just condemn those who've tried to escape. We have to look at the contribution that freedom of religion or belief can make to the progress towards more prosperous, harmonious and stable societies, and societies where the human dignity of every individual is affirmed and protected. Now, for me, religious freedom is a cause that came looking for me rather than the other way around. In 1979, as a brand new, youngest member of the House of Commons, I became involved in the campaign to free 7 Siberian Pentecostal Christians who, in 1978, had taken refuge in the American embassy in Moscow. It took 5 years and the interventions of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II before, in June 1983, they were allowed to leave the Soviet Union. Repeatedly for me, individual cases and stories inspired me and made me see how we take our own religious freedoms for granted. Their stories matter. Our campaigns for the Siberian 7 led to the formation of the Jubilee Campaign and a private visit to the family of the jailed Christian musician Valery Baranov in what was then Leningrad, St. Petersburg. And I also visited notable Jewish refuseniks like Vladimir and Masha Schlepak, and later campaigned for the Orthodox dissenter Alexander Ogorodnikov. Through my political work, I had the opportunity to visit Romania and took the opportunity to successfully raise the case of an Orthodox priest imprisoned by Ceausescu, and to later campaign for and met Richard Wurmbrand, tortured and imprisoned for 14 years. I met Cardinal Alexandra Todea, the Greek Catholic priest who spent 16 years in prison and 27 years under house arrest, and the wonderful resistance leader Doina Cornea and Laszlo Tokes, the Protestant clergyman who became the hero of the 1989 revolution, and to be able to be with him in 2019 to commemorate the events in Timișoara. Knowing their stories led to the building of alliances with like-minded people across the political divides and through civil society and NGOs, charities and campaign groups. Going and seeing for myself was fundamental, collecting the evidence and not merely relying on press and second-hand reports. It's the only way to make Article 18 a verb. It's the only way to make it more than just a political slogan. Meeting those who have been beaten, tortured, imprisoned, raped or bereaved never leaves you unchanged. You can't put your hands into someone else's wounds and remain unaffected. And it's our job, those of us who are privileged to have platforms and to be able to speak, it's our job to give voice to the stories. William Wilberforce once famously said that once the facts had been laid before the House of Commons, no one could any longer use the excuse that they did not know. Our duty is to make sure that people know. As recently as last Thursday in Parliament, in calling for the recognition of the Ukrainian Holodomor, Stalin's 1932-33 mass starvation of Ukraine, we called for it to be recognized as a genocide. And I recalled how in 1989, with a small Jubilee campaign delegation, I went to Lviv, and I've never forgotten the sheer courage and determination of faith-inspired pro-democracy activists risking their lives to throw off the shackles and the chains of the Soviet Union. As George Weigel puts it, the secret of courage is faith, faith in a larger reality than ourselves. I visited Greek Catholic churches that Stalin had closed 40 years earlier, and where every day fresh flowers were defiantly left at the doors to replace the ones removed earlier by Soviet soldiers. Religious belief had been violently repressed. Bishop Pavlo Vasilik and Evangel, a politician and a dissident, had spent 17 years and 18 years respectively in the Soviet death camp at Perm. I met a young priest who'd been sent 3 years earlier to Chernobyl to clear radioactive waste without any protective clothing simply because he'd been caught celebrating the liturgies in the open. These people wanted their stories known, and I was grateful to the BBC and the independent newspaper for enabling that to happen. The stories matter because they illustrate why, even as we meet here in Prague, Ukrainians are fighting to the bitter end to protect their hard-won freedoms. and will resist Putin's mendacious attempts to crush democratic rights and sovereignty, to roll the clock back and reverse the gains made, as the minister was saying to us a few minutes ago, to roll the clock back across Europe with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The war in Ukraine isn't merely about territory, it's about the very soul of a nation. It's about the attempted extinction, the annihilation of a nation. And that's why 42 million people have become its army. But this is also a war against the post-war European order. It's notable that President Zelensky is the grandson of a man whose 3 Jewish brothers were all murdered, executed by the Nazis. None of us who enjoy those freedoms can retreat into our own little world and forget what is happening beyond. We can't hide in the phony comfort and the isolation of a neutral world of cuckoo clocks and ski resorts and chocolate. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy, Ronald Reagan said this: "We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. It was true then and it's true now, not least as we contemplate the axis of dictators, Xi, Putin, Kim, and Khamenei, every bit as dangerous as the axis which confronted World War II allies." In Hamlet, William Shakespeare has Claudius observe that when sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. Friends, it would be a grave mistake to see this alliance of dictators, theocrats, authoritarians, and jihadists as separate threats. Their ideological differences will be parked temporarily as they use one another to pursue their shared hatred of the free world and its democracies. Take North Korea, which I visited. There are 300,000 people in concentration camps, many incarcerated because of their religious beliefs. The UN's own Commission of Inquiry called it a state without parallel and said that crimes against humanity, the technical definition, had been committed there. Yet 10 years later, the Security Council has still failed to refer those responsible to the International Criminal Court. A week ago, I handed President Yoon of the Republic of Korea a letter urging him to use the ROK's forthcoming membership of the Security Council to champion religious freedom, and especially the plight of hundreds of escapees, many of whom have religious beliefs and who are at this very time being forcibly returned to North Korea by China in complete breach of the 1951 Refugee Convention. In the early 1980s, I travelled to Shanghai and I met with underground Christians and heard a great deal about the story of the Cultural Revolution and China. In the early 1970s, I'd refused to join with contemporaries who, as liberals, should have known better in support of the Red Guards in China. Where were the protests as Mao's ideology and policies, everything from the Great Leap Forward to the Cultural Revolution, led to vast numbers of deaths, estimated to range from 40 to 80 million people? Mass starvation, mass execution, prison labour and persecution on grounds of ethnicity, religion and political dissent. These were the hallmarks of a truly evil despotic regime. Mao unleashed a brutal campaign of re-education, terrorized any form of dissent, and viciously crushed traditional ways of life and religion in places like Tibet. Under successive leaders, it's crushed dissent in the massacre of Tiananmen Square, destroyed democracy, and two systems, one country in Hong Kong, where religious freedom is now increasingly under attack. Daily threats threaten the 23 million people of Taiwan, and of course there is a genocide which has been unleashed against the Uyghur Muslims, and it's great to see my friend Nuri Turkel here at the conference with us. Where have been the protests as Xi Jinping fought in emulation of Mao, in imposing his own cult of personality and authoritarianism, replaces Scripture and the Holy Bible, as pastors and bishops are imprisoned, and reports only last week of mosques shut down in Ningxia and in Gansu? The compliant silence from countries who are now indebted vassal states and who should be concerned about their fellow co-religionists has been deafening. I visited Western China, I visited Tibet, I've met with the Dalai Lama, and my university and my city in Liverpool were threatened by the CCP for inviting him to Liverpool and indeed giving him an honorary degree. Having visited Tibet, I've hosted testimony sessions from Buddhist monks, from a Uyghur doctor who was forced to remove organs of Falun Gong, and for exiled Hong Kongers, and the family of Jimmy Lai, one of 1,200 jailed in Hong Kong, and like arrested lawyers Martin Lee and Margaret Ng, inspired by his religious faith. And let's not, friends, forget the heroic story of the courageous woman Zhan Zhan. Next week, when we commemorate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we will think a lot about Article 18, but think about Article 19 as well. The right to disperse information, the right to tell stories, the right to investigate. She, inspired by her faith, became a journalist and a lawyer, and after going to Wuhan to ask all the right questions about the origins of COVID, which has killed at least 3 million people, she was tortured and given a 4-year prison sentence. She's written these words: "Even if I were a bruised reed, I won't break. Even if I were a dying lamp, I won't be extinguished." Let's at least send a message from this ministerial to the People's Republic of China that it's an outrage that she continues to be in a prison cell. To those who seek accommodations and concordats with the CCP, I would simply say, never forget that no regime or organization in our global history has killed more people than the CCP. And in other parts of the world, a different ideology threatens religious freedom, diversity, and pluralism, a different kind of authoritarianism. On Red Wednesday, Fiona and I met Dominic and Margaret. 18 months ago in Owo, Ondo State, their church of St. Francis Xavier was attacked by jihadists and 40 congregants were murdered. Margaret's shattered legs had to be amputated. In a culture of impunity, no one has been charged or brought to justice. And last year, their bishop, Jude, came to Parliament and spoke at a meeting I chaired. He warned British officials that it was insulting and illiterate to attribute such atrocities to climate change. Did they not understand jihadist ideology? I met with Rebecca Sharibu, the mother of Leah, who, aged 14, was one of the schoolgirls seized in 2018 at Dapchi in Yobo State by Boko Haram, ISIS, West Africa. She refused to renounce her faith and was forcibly converted, raped, impregnated, and enslaved. She is still alive, and yet the Nigerian government have failed to release her. I see Mervyn Thomas here, with whom I've worked often on these causes over the years. Together we stood outside the Nigerian High Commission in London to protest the fate of Leah and others. Religious persecution is on the rise across Africa. It's self-evident. It's a major factor in the recent wave of fresh genocidal attacks in Darfur, directed against the wrong kind of African Muslims by Arab Sudanese jihadists. It's a contagion that could threaten the stability and future of vast numbers of people. It's the same virus at work in Pakistan, which I visited in 2019 to help secure the release of Asia Bibi, the illiterate Christian sentenced to death for fabricated charges of blasphemy. It turns minorities, including Ahmadis and Hindus, into second-class citizens, with Christians being given employment in menial work, such as cleansing sewers and latrines. In neighbouring Afghanistan, the Taliban perpetrate genocide against Hazaras. And in India, as I heard last night from a young Indian woman, religious minorities, including Christians and Muslims, face horrific attacks by Hindutva extremists. By contrast, one can point to the founding fathers like Nehru and Jinnah and the constitutions that they created, and it's significant that Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a signatory on behalf of Pakistan to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I could go on, but I know that my time is passing. Let me end by saying that last week in a parliamentary committee, I once again raised our failure to investigate, prosecute, or bring to justice those responsible for the heinous crime of genocide. And I raised the case of the Yazidis and Christians in northern Iraq, whom I visited in 1929. And I said this was hardly a fringe or peripheral issue. 4 out of 5 people have a religious belief in the world, and the denial of religious liberty is always a harbinger. Those countries that deny religious freedom are serial human rights abusers, denying every other human right too. It's a litmus test. Nations that uphold religious freedom uphold other freedoms, and that is why it matters so much. My late mother was a native Irish speaker who I was told came from a family of Senachie, those who in the oral tradition handed down the stories from one generation to another. We owe it to those whose freedoms have been compromised or denied, their liberty to learn their stories and to hand them on, especially as we come to mark these anniversaries of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Crime of Genocide and the events which led to their proclamation 75 years ago. Thank you very much, Robert, for inviting me to give this opening address.
Thank you very much, Lord David Alton of Liverpool. And now let me invite the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Nazila Ghanea. Nazila Ghanea is Professor of International Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford. She has researched and published in international human rights law, contributed actively to networks interested in freedom of religion or belief, and has wisely advised states and numerous organizations, including our IRFBA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with all of you, Excellencies, Ambassador Řehák, colleagues and friends. Let me share some research from the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter-Strategies. They observe that for the last decade and a half, we have been witnessing a worldwide resurgence of reactionary, nationalist, racist, anti-feminist and religious discourses and movements, as well as rapid authoritarian transformations of political systems in all regions of the world. These forces further deepen the non-democratic and anti-democratic features of their societies, including, and I quote, the expansion of their punitive and repressive nature and increasing state and parastate practices of violence, neutralization of resistance, and the marginalization of subordinate groups. This group's research stemmed from 3 years of research by 20 activist scholars from around the world who worked full-time on this project, and their scholarship was distilled into this volume. So let's consider some of the suggestions they make and how it might relate to freedom of religion or belief. The group observes that the ideological elements and political practices behind these phenomena diverge with more differences than commonalities between them. So they suggest that global authoritarianism does not in fact show up as global, but as heterogeneous and fragmented. We may observe some elements regarding freedom of religion or belief in light of this fragmented trend. The first is that this trend sees subordinate groups, including religious or belief minorities, and sometimes even religious and belief majorities in terms of numbers, targeted for marginalization, repression, and violence, as my esteemed co-panelists detailed so richly. Secondly, these lead to greater violations, not only of freedom of religion or belief, we might observe, but also a wide range of other human rights as well. It's very difficult, in fact, to target an example of violations of freedom of religion or belief that does not also see violations of other human rights regarding those who are targeted. And thirdly, we might observe that this deepening authoritarianism can calcify into the very narrative of politics and the institutions of government. And regrettably, sometimes they also seek justification through religious reference points and narratives. This calls for a nuanced appreciation by freedom of religion or belief champions and advocates from all of you, from all of us here, and requires us to continuously be mindful of our messaging. Religious or belief actors are not only victims. Regrettably, they may also sometimes be perpetrators of the infringement of the rights of others. There is a growing trend in political narratives and state institutions seeking populist support by marginalizing and subordinating so-called others, including because of religion or belief. This goes alongside the violation of numerous rights and also the rights of others. So we may need to be alert to the reference to religion or belief itself being used, in fact abused, in order to advance these objectives. And this is why the UN mandate on freedom of religion or belief has these three aspects of the right at the center of its focus. We need to give attention to these details and to the context. There is no neat distinction, at least that I have found, between authoritarian and non-authoritarian. If things were so neat, we could just focus our attention on freedom of religion or belief in those parts of the world, in those states, and rest confidently elsewhere. But the contributors to the study observed that liberal values are not mutually exclusive with authoritarian practice. And another observes that authoritarian institutional practices are embedded within democratic regimes, obviously some democratic regimes. So populist authoritarianism carries risk for freedom of religion or belief because it creates the political and social conditions and environment for either backsliding on freedom of religion or belief or selectivity on freedom of religion or belief at home and abroad. Authoritarian transformations also occur in liberal democracies, liberal democratic regimes, led by liberal governments who may be relying on the politics of control and discipline rather than consent building, this book suggests. So in short, while mainstream discourse, they quote, presents as opposing poles liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, in fact, they are intertwined and overlapping. But by noting this, or by at least remembering and taking note of this scholarship, I don't want to suggest that all violations are of equal gravity, nor do I want to create a false equivalence between different types of violations, different gravity of violations of freedom of religion or belief in different parts of the world. The balance of power in a society matters. Robust, independent institutions matter, even if there is partial backsliding or a risky trend that is developing in a country. The rule of law matters. Genuine elections can offer a return to upholding democratic values after a period in which authoritarian tendencies have gained traction in a society. Freedom of religion or belief infringements that enjoy the backing, the support, or are even led by the state and permeated in its laws, practices, and policies carry far greater risk for a greater number of people than the nevertheless worrying trend towards authoritarian tendencies and discourses that are exclusionary toward particular groups. So I'm saying that we should keep our focus on both, but I don't want to suggest that we can just equate them with one another or use one in order to, sometimes there are trade-offs, right? So people say, well, it's not so good in your country, as if we can then overlook mass violations in another. So I'm not trying to suggest or justify that discourse, but what I am trying to suggest is let's be mindful of freedom of religion or belief everywhere. Freedom of religion or belief violations that are part and parcel of state policy have a determination and resource behind them that often make them entrenched and often over generations. In endeavoring to advance freedom of religion or belief, we cannot afford to inadvertently start associating bad freedom of religion or belief records with populations rather than the state, nor can we consider freedom of religion or belief infringements as a concern exclusively concentrated in certain parts of the world and not others. Neither of these hold. Authoritarianism does not have a race, and authoritarianism does not have a religion. We mustn't lose sight of the higher standard enshrined in human rights. This is a definition given in the 1981 Declaration on all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief, a UN declaration that was adopted in 1981 and whose 25th anniversary was held here in Prague almost these exact days 17 years ago. Its Article 2 says that intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief means any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on religion or belief, and having as its purpose or as its effect nullification or impairment of the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis. This challenges all of us everywhere. Thank you very much to the Czech government for hosting this event, which will no doubt nourish us and deepen our resolve to continue to rid the world of freedom of religion or belief violence. Thank you to IRFBA for making this happen, your determined resolve to work on the challenges raised by freedom of religion or belief around all of you. And thanks to all of you, I'm humbled in trying to keep up with all the wonderful work that you do.
Please let me thank you to United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, and also all the panelists and people who did the invocation, who had the courage to sing and pray with us. Thank you very much.